Last semester, I enrolled in an introductory French course at my university. This was to learn at least a little bit of French so that I could read French papers about French filmmaking techniques, since I'm a pretty hardcore film student and I really love film as an art form. Plus, I needed some general education credit for my degree, so it made sense to take the course. I went to the first lecture kind of dreading it. I was taking 19 credit hours, which meant 6 classes in a single semester. And this class was 4 credit hours, meaning we met 4 days out of the week, every week. Very overwhelming schedule indeed. Needless to say, I didn't work a single job that semester. The professor, who I'll call Professor Moreau because it's one of the few French names I actually know, began to go through the syllabus, and I watched as the excitement that is usually present in students on the first day slowly left everyone's faces. Before I explain why, I have to address that this was the most basic French class that the university I attended offered, and was really meant for people who never took a lick of French in high school. Like me, Professor Moreau announced that not only would he be teaching the entire class in fluent French, with no English whatsoever, he wouldn't be answering questions in English at all. If you asked him a question in French, but got even a word or a conjugation wrong, he wouldn't answer you either. Attendance was mandatory as well, and you could only miss 4 class periods before he started dropping letter grades. Now, this attendance policy was unfair because we met for class just under 60 times that semester, meaning you would fail the course if you missed 8 class periods, which was only about 7% of the total course. I looked around the class and people looked like they couldn't drop this class fast enough. Then he announced that not only would we not be using a physical book, we'd be using a free website online, a site called Français Interactif. Now, this got some excitement back in the air. Textbook prices are terrible, and anything to lower the cost of education for students is great. That said, the site wasn't meant to replace a textbook. There was a free workbook and audio files to help with oral comprehension on it, and that helped me and some of the other students pass some of the exams. But the site's equivalent to the part of a textbook that actually teaches you the material was extremely lacking, sometimes only having a couple of paragraphs about a really important concept in the language. In short, it gave you a ton of ways to practice concepts, but almost no ways to learn them in the first place. This would have been totally fine if Professor Moreau would have explained things better in his lectures. But as you'll recall, he gave them entirely in French, and in fast fluent French. So picture this, you have to sit through 4 classes a week that you understand literally nothing of for an hour at a time, while the professor rambles on in a language that you don't understand, but are desperately trying to learn. On top of all that, you can't even ask him any questions in English, because he won't answer you. And you can't ask him any questions in French either, because you don't know how to do that properly yet. You won't for 3/4 of the semester, because the unit that covers question words and phrases was arbitrarily put a few weeks after midterms. On top of all that, you can't even really do your homework or study for exams because you have no idea what any of this means. Naturally, we, as a class, slowly started to get more and more frustrated as time went on. A few of us decided to band together and be friends and study partners to weather the storm. I'll call the important ones to the story Riley and Sophia. Sophia was a foreign exchange student from Spain who spoke perfect Spanish and was taking the class to learn French for when she went back to Europe. Now, we dug into what all other classes Professor Moreau taught and found out that he taught Spanish too. Perfect. We found a loophole. We could ask Sophia a question in English, and she could ask him in Spanish, since it wasn't asking him in English. He could answer in Spanish, and she could translate that back to us in English. Now, you might be saying to yourself that this is stupid and no self-respecting educator should teach in this broken, backwards way. You're right. This worked for a bit, but he started answering Sophia's Spanish questions in French to combat our little exploit of the rules. We were defeated and back to square one. We needed to devise a new plan because most of us were failing at this point and we were stressed beyond belief. Riley, a fraternity guy, and I, decidedly not a fraternity guy, became unlikely friends. He was a pretty naive kid, and he was a hardcore drinker. It visibly took a toll on him. He had a beer gut at 22, and addiction kind of mentally hollowed him out and made him flippant and emotional. The guy was super easy to anger, and he overreacted to everything. I felt bad for the guy, and even outside of the struggle in class, I tried my best to be there for him. We were talking one day, and we decided to meet up at the library and just theorize ways to crack the class to get at least a 60%. At the library, Riley was playing around on Français Interactif, trying to find the videos the professor would use for the oral part of the exam. Basically, you'd listen to the video and copy down whatever the person was saying for credit. Problem was, it was hard as hell, and it was easily the part of the exams that took the biggest chunk out of the class's grade. He couldn't find them on the site anywhere, and he got frustrated and gave up, so he started filling in the slots where you put answers on the homework pages of Français Interactif with random words. That's when we realized that when you do this, the site gives you the right answer, regardless, no matter how wrong you are. Essentially, we now had access to the entire course's answers for the homework section, and all we had to do was put one character into the answer boxes. Since all we had to do for the homework assignments was copy and paste our answers into a Word document and submit them online, we could theoretically do all the homework while knowing zero material whatsoever if we just changed the answers in Word. We sat for about 45 minutes and did the rest of the homework for the entire course, this way, in one sitting. We agreed to not turn it all in at once, so we couldn't get caught, and we agreed to keep our mouths shut and only share this with people who wouldn't rat on us. Obviously, we told Sophia. One of the things I'll never forget about that first French class was that, during the final, one of the students started to quietly weep. Then the weeping got louder, then louder still. The student was clutching his head in his hands, and you could feel the palpable, impotent frustration at his inability to do French correctly. After I finished the final, I saw him outside the class, staring out a window in the hall. I asked if he was all right and what he was crying about, and he told me he couldn't answer even the most basic questions asking for words for things like left and right and up and down. That was the thing that finally broke him. That got to me, man. Most of the kids failed the course, even some of the ones who used the homework exploit. Riley and Sophia passed with a D, and I passed with a C, surprisingly. The professor actually liked me, for some reason, and graded my exams a bit more fairly. Even still, I'm an A and B student, one in the honors program at my university, so a C kind of stunned my grade point average. But seeing as more than half the class failed, I counted my lucky stars that I got off easy. I went to enroll in my classes for the next semester, and I had completely forgotten that I still had to take another French class for my degree. I checked the class list, and the second class you're supposed to take in the progression was only taught by Professor Moreau. No other professor taught beginning French 2, apparently. This struck me as kind of odd, so I checked the rest of the French classes that were available. All of them, all 6 courses in the French department, were taught by Professor Moreau. He was the only teacher the department had. My stomach dropped as I realized I had locked myself into yet another class taught by the worst professor I've ever had to this day. This is where the revenge begins, and I'm sorry if that preamble was too long, but I had to give context as to how horrible Professor Moreau was. Even still, I'm frankly not doing him justice. His class was an artful train wreck of incompetence in the slowest slow motion available over nearly 60 class periods. And I had to do it again, only this time with harder material. I had been keeping up with Riley and Sophia over the winter break, and Sophia was going back to Spain, so she wouldn't be in the next class with me. But I got Riley to enroll in the same section of Beginning French 2 as me. Professor Moreau passed out the syllabus to Beginning French 2, and it was the exact same as French 1, down to us using Français Interactif again, just in the higher chapters instead of the basic chapters. Now here's the thing about learning a foreign language. You have to build from the basics, or else none of the other stuff makes sense. None of us in that class, not one person, knew any of the material past maybe chapter 3. Most of us didn't even know how to ask questions. I did, so I asked questions for people who didn't, since Sophia wasn't there. Well, if you thought we bumbled through the basic material, no harder bumbling took place than when we started on things that have no direct English translation. When he asked students questions in this class, they'd just kind of look at him dumbfounded and shrug. We got a study guide for our first exam, and I was going to study my ass off so that I could get a better grade than a C. Besides a brief stint with depression my first semester that made me not be able to go to classes and fail one of my courses, a C was the lowest grade I had gotten at university. I must have studied for 20 hours over the course of a week before the exam. I hadn't even put that much effort into classes for my major. I got into class on the day of the exam, and nothing that I had spent all that time studying was on it. I bombed that test spectacularly, getting a 30%. At this point, I was pretty much done. I was willing to go to my professor's office hours and ask him how I was supposed to study for his exams effectively, and his response is what began my quest to get revenge on him. He told me to watch YouTube videos. I don't know what it was about this that got me so angry, but I was fired up. But that wasn't all that drove me to take the revenge I took on this guy. No, what drove me to go after this guy was Riley calling me up crying after getting his exam back. He did worse than I did. He got a 15%. He kept repeating through sobs that he just wanted to be a good student and that he didn't want to disappoint his mom again. I'm not ashamed to admit that I cried at this. I thought back to that kid in French I after the final, about my peers, and about Riley, and something inside me snapped. I was going to get this guy fired and peacefully do anything else I could to ruin this guy's life one way or another, and Riley was going to be my right-hand man. We met at his dorm and started brainstorming. It was about halfway through the semester after our midterms. We both had a job, a significant other, extracurricular activities, and I was taking 19 hours, again, this semester. We were going to need time on our side, a commodity that neither of us had, and we were going to need it quickly. We knew that the professor was going to be gone for a week at a conference right after spring break, so there was a 2-week window there. But even still, we needed more time for what we started planning to do. I faked a doctor's note for 2 weeks' absence, and Riley agreed to use all 4 of his absences to meet at the same time. French was supposed to occur and plan our peaceful academic coup. Now, I knew I was eventually going to get caught from word go. But I was so confident that I could get this guy fired before I would have a disciplinary hearing that I took the gamble, and Professor Moreau took the bait. He excused me for 2 whole weeks. So you're probably wondering what we actually did. Well, the reason we needed so much time is that we needed time to both conduct interviews from the class as well as collect data on scores. We got a total of 13 out of the 17 students to make a statement about Professor Moreau's performance in his beginning French 2 class, and all of them were negative. This was just in one section of the course. Then, we asked if we could have their exam scores so that we could have some hard data to nail this guy with. All but 2 complied. We did some quick math and determined that more than half the class failed the exams, with most scoring between 30 and 50. But as it turns out, we didn't even need the exam scores given to us. We figured out that the online grade database site that our school uses, so students can monitor their grades without asking their professors, has a built-in feature that shows the class average of every assignment that's put into the gradebook. Not a single assignment had a class average above a 50, except for the homework, which had a class average of around 80. No doubt thanks to the stupid exploit in the website. Sure enough, I got tagged with a notice that I broke the discipline code of the university because obviously my doctor's note was obvious, but it didn't matter. I had everything I needed to go to the foreign language department chair and sort this situation out. So, I did. I showed the department chair all the data, let him listen to the audio from the student testimonies, as well as gave my own testimony on the course. After showing him all this, he was dumbfounded. Not only did the chair not know that Professor Moreau was a terrible teacher, almost nobody did course evaluations for French 1, so he thought that Professor Moreau was doing a decent job. He took all my evidence and gave it to the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and a couple weeks later I got an email saying that Professor Moreau was gone, and that I was going to be withdrawn from the course, along with everyone else who would have likely failed. Those who would have passed got to get a credit-received grade without having to take the final. He got fired one semester before he qualified for his tenure. But that's not the most shocking part of this tale. You're probably wondering how he got deported, and how I found out that he got deported because of his firing. Well, after my disciplinary hearing got thrown out because the complainant was no longer affiliated with the university, I got more than I bargained for. During his lectures, one of the few times he spoke English was after he introduced the syllabus on the first day. He had everyone introduce themselves, and he started the exercise by introducing himself. Well, in his introduction, I remember him saying something about him being an immigrant from Venezuela. I live in the United States, and some of you might know that we have pretty strict visa policies. Well, Riley is pretty conservative. After our work got Professor Moreau fired, we celebrated by getting some beer and shooting the breeze. We talked about random aspects of the course, and the fact that he was an immigrant got brought up. Apparently, Riley didn't know this, and he was pretty upset about it. I tried to calm him down, but he went on a rant that I tried to politely nod along to while tuning out, since I'm not really about that. I didn't think anything of it until a couple of days later. He called me up and told me that he tipped Professor Moreau off to a certain immigration agency for a visa check, his words not mine, and that now all we had to do was wait. I was shocked. I didn't think this would go this far. I feigned that I was pleased with this, but in reality, I was kind of bummed. Since he was probably here on an academic visa since he was a professor, he probably was going back home to Venezuela. I am glad, though, that he won't be teaching any more of my fellow students at my university, because I wouldn't wish his classes on anyone. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized just how broken the system had been. Professor Moreau had somehow convinced the department chair that everything was fine for years. Probably because students either didn't fill out evaluations or were too intimidated to be honest. The fact that he was the only French professor meant that the department had no backup, no way to compare his teaching methods to anyone else's. It was a perfect storm of institutional failure. I started thinking about all the students who had taken his classes before me, all the people who had struggled and failed and probably blamed themselves for not being smart enough or dedicated enough. How many students had given up on learning French entirely because of this one terrible professor? How many had taken hits to their grade point averages that affected their scholarships or graduate school applications? The more I thought about it, the more justified I felt in what Riley and I had done. We hadn't just helped ourselves, we helped every future student who would have been subjected to his incompetent teaching. The weeks following Professor Moreau's firing were strange. Students from other sections of his classes started reaching out to me, thanking me for what I'd done. Apparently, word had spread quickly about who was responsible for his termination. Some people treated me like a hero, others thought I'd gone too far. There were a few students who actually defended Professor Moreau, claiming that his teaching method was just too advanced for lazy American students. I found this baffling. How could anyone defend a teaching style that resulted in more than half the class failing? But I suppose some people would rather blame the students than admit the system failed them. Riley, for his part, became somewhat of a celebrity in his fraternity. They thought what we'd done was legendary. I, on the other hand, just wanted to move on and focus on my film studies, the reason I'd taken French in the first place. The department chair personally apologized to me for not catching the problem sooner. He explained that they were already in the process of hiring 2 new French professors to replace Professor Moreau and expand the department. He also said that they were implementing a new system of mandatory course evaluations and regular classroom observations to prevent this from ever happening again. I felt vindicated, but also exhausted. The whole ordeal had taken so much energy and time away from my other classes and my personal life. My significant other had been incredibly patient with me during all of this, but I could tell the stress had taken a toll on our relationship. I made a mental note to make it up to them once everything settled down. As for the immigration situation with Professor Moreau, I tried not to think about it too much. That part hadn't been my doing, and while I felt somewhat responsible for putting Riley in a position where he learned about the professor's immigration status, I couldn't control his actions. Still, the knowledge that a man was potentially being deported because of a chain of events I'd set in motion weighed on me. I tried to rationalize it by telling myself that if his visa wasn't in order, that was his responsibility, not mine. But deep down, I knew that if we hadn't gotten him fired, the immigration check probably never would have happened. It was a moral gray area that I wasn't entirely comfortable with. A few weeks after the firing, I ran into one of the students who had been in my first French class, the one who had cried during the final exam. I asked him how he was doing, and if he'd heard about Professor Moreau. He had, and he actually thanked me personally. He told me that failing that class had almost made him drop out of university entirely, that he'd felt so stupid and worthless. He'd eventually retaken for French with a different professor the following year and had gotten an A. Hearing his story made everything worth it. This wasn't just about grades or revenge. It was about preventing an incompetent educator from destroying students' confidence and academic careers. The disciplinary hearing that had been scheduled for my fake doctor's note was indeed thrown out, just as I'd predicted. The university decided that since the professor who filed the complaint was no longer employed there, and since I'd been withdrawn from the course anyway, there was no point in pursuing it. I'd gotten incredibly lucky, and I knew it. If things had gone slightly differently, I could have been expelled. But the gamble had paid off. Riley and I remained friends for the rest of our time at university, though we never did anything quite that dramatic again. He eventually got help for his drinking problem, something I gently encouraged him to do throughout our friendship. I like to think that our success in taking down Professor Moreau had given him confidence that he could tackle other challenges in his life, including his addiction. We stayed in touch after graduation, and last I heard, he was doing well. Sober for over 2 years and working a good job. Sophia, my Spanish friend from the first French class, reached out to me when she heard about what happened. She was back in Spain by then, but she sent me a message saying she wished she'd been there to help. I told her that her presence in that first class had been help enough. Without her Spanish translation trick, we might not have made it through at all. She laughed and said she was learning French much more successfully now with a proper teacher in Spain. The whole experience taught me a lot about institutional failure and the importance of speaking up when something is wrong. For years, students had suffered through Professor Moreau's classes, probably assuming that they were the problem, that they just weren't good enough at French. It took someone willing to take a risk and collect evidence to expose the truth. I also learned about the unintended consequences of revenge. While I'd set out to get a bad professor fired, the situation had spiraled into something much larger with the deportation issue. I still don't know exactly what happened to Professor Moreau after he was fired. I heard rumors that he did indeed have to leave the country due to visa issues, but I never confirmed it. Part of me didn't want to know. I preferred to think of the victory as simply removing a terrible teacher from a position where he could hurt students, rather than potentially ruining someone's entire life. But I also couldn't deny that there was a part of me that felt he'd gotten what he deserved. He'd failed to do his job, had caused countless students to fail and doubt themselves, and had shown no remorse or willingness to change his teaching methods. Sometimes people face consequences for their actions, and sometimes those consequences are harsh. As for me, I eventually took French 3 with one of the new professors the department hired, and I actually enjoyed it. I learned more in that one semester than I had in the previous 2 combined. I finally got to read those French filmmaking papers I'd originally wanted to study, and it felt like a victory not just for me, but for every student who'd ever struggled in Professor Moreau's class. In the end, I don't regret what I did. The system failed, and someone had to fix it. That someone just happened to be me.